Out of the blue. These are my thoughts, 5 quick thoughts on the ouster of Robert Jenrick from both the shadow cabinet and the Conservative Parliamentary Party. He's had the whip withdrawn by Kemi Badenoch earlier today. I'm Daniel Cremin. This is Cremin's Corner, my channel on YouTube, and I hope you enjoy it. Right, so let's look at the political context here. Robert Jenrick was a really high profile figure over the past sort of 18 months in the Conservative Party. He was one of the leading candidates at the last Conservative leadership election against Kemi Badenoch. He lost in the runoff to her. And there was a lot of buyer's regret, I think, out in the grassroots of the Conservative Party, because Robert never sort of stopped running, as it were. After he lost the leadership election, he continued following his appointment as a Shadow Justice Secretary to kind of act as if he was running a leadership campaign in many respects. And this has been a kind of a constant dynamic across Kemi's tenure that really, I think, from the very beginning, has sort of saddled her leadership and sort of undermined her authority. So anyway, the thoughts on what's happened. First of all, let's capture this. So she has come out and said that she's got irrefutable evidence that Robert was planning to defect, clearly to reform. There's nobody else who's going to realistically defect to, not going to join Rupert Lowe's pressure group, is he? Restore Britain. He's very unlikely to join Advance UK. So this was about reform. She had credible evidence, she claims, that he was going to join reform at a point where it could do maximum damage, inflict maximum damage to her beloved party, the Conservatives, and that she felt she had no choice but to act. There's more coming out in the briefings that she felt there was growing evidence that he was, acting in a way that undermined shadow cabinet colleagues, and clearly sort of behaving in an unethical way. There's reports on social media from various members of the lobby circulating now in tweets that he was taking copious amounts of notes at a shadow cabinet away day meeting discussing party strategy. Sounds a little bit paranoid to me. I think the point of being at an away day is to actually absorb what the party strategy is and kind of engage with it. But hey ho. Anyway, Robert has been removed from the Parliamentary Party. There were reports on GB News of an angry conversation with the Deputy Chief Whip and the phone being slammed down. At the point that I'm recording, I still haven't seen anything come out from Robert himself as of yet commenting, so I can't kind of give you his take. But what Nigel Farage has said, and I put some credence on this, is that yes, while conversations have happened between himself and Robert Jenrick, and also with a number of other senior Conservative figures in the party, both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, I imagine, and probably with ex-MPs, while those conversations have happened, there was nothing imminent from Jenrick in particular, and that he was surprised by all of this. He insisted he hadn't leaked anything, that nobody in Reform had about any past dialogues. There's been reports that Kemi was aware of a dinner that took place in December between the two men. For me, the way I read things here, first of all, I would say I don't believe that Robert Jenrick was imminently about to defect. I just don't believe it. I believe his intention was still to try and hold on and challenge for the leadership, to replace Kemi Badenoch after the local elections on May the 7th, to maybe move at that point. I just don't buy that this was, all in the works for a very imminent defection. I may be wrong, and if I am, fair enough. And if that emerges and there's irrefutable evidence of that, fair enough. I just don't buy it. I think that Kemi, is dealing with the fallout of the Zahawi defection and was already nervous. I think her team were already nervous, and I think things have probably come to a head. I suspect there's an element of paranoia at play with some of this. That's not to say that I don't think Robert Jenrick was probably cultivating multiple options. I'm sure there were some conversations with figures in and around Reform and in over the past year. And I certainly think that, he's not always been the ideal team player from Kemi's perspective, and I think there's some validity to that with some of the things he's kind of done over the past year. He's been very outspoken on areas well outside of the justice portfolio. That's not to say he hasn't been very effective at doing that. He's been a prolifically successful political communicator and something of a political entrepreneur over the past year and a half. He's ironically run a much better kind of campaign in the public lens than he ever did when he was running for leader of the party. He came alive to a much greater extent and has gained a lot of people who didn't vote for him and who were suspicious of him have kind of flipped over to really valuing his contribution in British politics. Now, look, where do I think this leaves Robert and reform? So on that question, it's not an absolute 100% that he does imminently join now that he's been sort of, booted out of the Conservative Party. He may play for time and look to kind of challenge the decision. But there's a realistic possibility that he does come into reform in the coming days. Possibly even today, maybe the coming weeks. I think conversations will happen. There's a good possibility that he does come across fairly quickly. I think his hand is not that strong to kind of choose and pick what kind of role he plays and so forth. I think if he were to take the reform whip now, I think the position that he finds himself in, having lost the Conservative whip, it probably reduces his hand in any negotiations quite considerably. I think it strengthens Nigel Farage's hand both in dealing specifically with Jenrick, but also actually the perception of reform as now the natural party of the right, the dominant force on the right, the next natural party of government in British politics, most likely. Because the position Labour are in, I just don't see them being in government for very much longer and being back in anytime soon. So I think reform, is kind of rapidly establishing, it's a bit like drying cement. Things are solidifying into place that reform look like the major political force, certainly on the right and probably arguably in British politics going forward for some time. And I think Robert's got a role to play in all of that. But, Nigel right now indisputably will look like the main man in British politics for some years to come. I think this strengthens his hand. I think with as regards other defections and so forth, the appeal of reform is likely to grow both within parliamentary circles and beyond within the wider Conservative Party membership. I think some of the other sort of the right-wing intellectual influences as well in British politics will probably start to now migrate more and more towards reform. I do think at the same time, from a Kemi perspective, that in the short term, this probably does help her leadership authority a little bit, the decisive action she's finally kind of taken belatedly, after repeated sort of provocations. I think in the short run, it actually does help Kemi a little bit, but medium to long term, I think she's got significant challenges now to kind of hold her shrunken party together. They're substantially diminished to begin with, but I think a lot of people were holding on realistically because of the factor of people being present, like Lord Frost, like Robert Jenrick. Now, look, Lord Frost has already resigned the whip to take on the IEA leadership role. That's the Institute of Economic Affairs, a right-leaning libertarian type classical liberal think tank. People like Robert Jenrick and Zahawi going, it's people read these things and they interpret this is no longer the party for me. Now, Kemi can argue that, this was all down to Robert's personal ambition and he, had no principles and all of these kind of things. But I think people can see that Jenrick, was probably in politics for the right reason and has been, championing many of the right sort of causes. Now, some of the tactics he's gone around with and not necessarily always being a team player don't speak that well. But I think what he's been focusing on and the candor and the kind of the intellectual honesty and rigor that he's gone about his analysis with, I should say, I think all of that's been pretty welcome and pretty credible, very much to his credit. So, there is a feeling now, I think, on the right that this might be for many people, an ominous sign for the future for the Conservatives and a turning point. I think Kemi will last till the local elections, almost certainly. I think her future will in no small part be decided by how they perform in those local elections and in the devolved elections. Um, there's no guarantee she carries on and on and on. She could well be challenged in the summer, but there isn't really now a natural figure on the right who I think can sort of unify the right wing MPs and the sort of the residual right wing membership of the party to kind of hold on. I think her replacement is likely to be somebody to Kemi's left, James Cleverly, who's much more aligned to the sort of the Cameroon and One Nation conservative perspective on the future and how the party needs to position itself and where, what its electoral strategy should be. Ultimately, there just isn't that figure anymore because Suella Braverman, people like Badenoch and so forth, they've really gone out of their way to discredit her. Preeti Patel and Suella have suffered because of their time in the Home Office, the perception of decisions taken, during their tenures, things like the Wallace wave, where there was the, judicial intervention by the government to kind of get effectively a super injunction on reporting of a large-scale Afghan resettlement program that included people who were, in some cases, considered security concerns, who were not interpreters, were not aides to the British Army. They were people of interest to the British military, who, because of being on a list that got leaked, ended up having to be extracted. That's the claim, anyway, that I believe has been substantiated. So in those circumstances, you have already two of the most natural figures that were left on the right of the party, discredited in the eyes of a lot of of people as realistic leadership contenders, and potential prime ministers who could bring the sort of people on the right who've moved to reform back into the fold of the Conservatives. I just think they're going to struggle now to find credible sort of figures on the right to do that. Danny Kruger, who was another very thoughtful, outspoken voice on the right, he's already come over to reform. There's just not that much bench strength left in the Conservative Party now. People like Lord Frost, already gone, as I say. James Orr, who was in the sort of the national conservatism movement, wasn't an MP, wasn't in the Lords, but was a big figure with a certain constituency of the thinking right within and around in and around the Conservative Party. They've all come across to reform. More are coming across all the time. And I think it's the beginning of the end, really, for the Conservatives potentially. Hard to see how Kemi turns it round. So yeah, it will be interesting to see what Nigel Farage has to say later this afternoon. He's obviously said he's going to have some have a call with Jenrick and see what he wants to do, see where things lead. Let's see and watch this space. But yeah, certainly for the moment, Robert's out of the blue. Is he into the turquoise? Let's find out.